Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I am joined by Christoph.
Hello. Good to see everyone. I'm glad you're here.
You got to see them in your mind's eye.
Oh, I do. And everybody is very attractive. I think we have the best looking listeners in the world.
He's married, folks.
Oh, yeah. Hey, slow down. That's not what I'm just saying. As it turns out, our listeners look great. So,
all right, we're going to finish up on the attack of Pearl Harbor. So, are you ready to get underway?
I am.
All right. So, we're going to start with the casualties. We'll start with the casualties and damage on our side. So,
all right.
90 minutes. This is all that the attack took.
Golly.
So the Japanese losses are these. 55 Japanese airmen and 9 submariners were killed in the attack. And 1 was captured. His name was Kazuo Sakamaki. Japan had 414 available planes and 350 were used. 29 were lost. 9 in the first wave, which was 3 fighters, 1 bomber, and 5 torpedo bombers. And 20 in the second wave, which was 6 fighters and 14 dive bombers. And there were 74 of them damaged by anti-aircraft fire from the ground. So now we're going to get into the third wave that you wanted to know about.
Yes.
So there are some accounts, several Japanese junior officers, which included Fuchida and Genda. They urged Nagamoto to carry out a third strike in order to sink more of the warships that were in the harbor, and also to damage the bases, maintenance shops, dry dock facilities, and oil tank yards.
Yeah.
Fuchida gave a first-hand account of this meeting several times after the war, but some historians have cast doubt on this and many other Fuchida's later claims, which conflict at times with documented historic records. Genda, who optioned during the planning of the attack that without an invasion, 3 strikes were necessary to fully disable the Pacific Fleet. But he was denied requesting an additional attack. But, it is undisputed that the captains of the 5 carriers in the task force reported that they were willing and ready to carry out a third strike soon after the second returned. But the admiral decided to withdraw for a number of different reasons. 1, American anti-aircraft performance had improved considerably during the second strike, and 2/3 of Japan's losses were incurred during this second wave.
Right.
The admiral felt that if he launched a third strike, he would be risking 3/4 of the combined fleet strength to wipe out the remaining targets, while suffering higher aircraft losses. The location of the American carriers were still not known, and the admiral was concerned his force was now within range of land-based bombers.
Oh, yeah.
The admiral was also uncertain whether the U.S. had enough surviving planes remaining on Oahu, or even across the entire chain, to launch an attack against its carriers. 4, a third wave would have required substantial preparation and turnaround time, and it would have meant returning planes would have to land at night.
Ah.
At the time, only the Royal Navy had developed night carrier techniques, so this was a huge risk. The first 2 waves had launched the entirety of the combined fleet's air strength. The third wave would have required landing both the first and second wave before launching the first wave again.
This is surprising to me, just because I know it was early afternoon, right, when they hit? Like the first wave, the first strike?
No, it was in the morning.
I don't see how... how long would it have taken for them to get back to the carrier such that it would be a night landing? Because that I don't understand.
The Admiral had only set up for 2 waves.
Right.
So the weapons and fuel for those 2 waves were gotten out. For the 3rd wave, they would have had to gotten more weapons out. They would have had to refuel everything again. And it would have taken a substantial amount of time.
Okay. That makes more sense. No, that makes perfect sense then.
This situation is actually highlighted in the Battle of Midway. If you remember when they were trying to switch out weapons for land versus sea attacks, when the Japanese realized that the American fleet was right there.
Mm-hmm.
They were having to switch from land-based weapons to sea-based weapons, and it was a complete mess, and it takes a lot of time. And thankfully for us, not thankfully for them, that also left weapons in the hangar bay when it was hit by American planes, which completely obliterated that carrier.
The whole thing is very fascinating to me. So the timeline, and I wasn't fully aware of the weapon switching, but that makes sense, or the necessity to refuel, rearm, that makes sense. And then the justification that you mentioned for not launching a 3rd wave, all of those are very good reasons. And in, again, the movie Tora Tora Tora, where it's a dramatized version of events, but they're actual events that unfolded. The crew is unhappy that they're not launching the 3rd wave, and it's like, no, we shouldn't do that. We've already done enough. And I'm like, I don't know. That doesn't seem like how they would have approached it. But what you're saying makes way more sense as far as what led to the decision.
There's a couple more points. Number 5, the task force fuel situation did not permit him to remain in the waters of Pearl Harbor for much longer. He was at the very limit of his logistical support.
I see.
So staying would have risked running low on fuel, perhaps even having to abandon destroyers on the route home.
That would have been embarrassing.
Yeah. Lastly, he believed that the second strike had essentially accomplished the mission's main objective, which the main objective was neutralizing the Pacific Fleet.
Mm-hmm.
And he did not want to risk further losses. It was also the IJN's practice to prefer the conversation of strength over total destruction of the enemy.
I could see that.
So, if the 3rd strike had happened, it would have likely focused on the remaining warships, and military historians have suggested that any potential damage to the shore facilities would have actually hampered the Pacific Fleet a lot more seriously. If they had been wiped out, serious operations in the Pacific would have been postponed for more than a year.
Wow, really?
Yeah, this is coming from Admiral Nimitz himself. Quote, "It would have prolonged the war another 2 years." And Yamamoto actually supported Nagamuto's withdrawal without launching a 3rd wave. But, of course, in retrospect, Yamamoto was like, no, this was a big mistake.
Oh, okay.
Well, because they didn't hit the vital dockyards, the oil tank farm. So the U.S. was able to respond quickly and effectively in the Pacific.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder how much of the initial support was a result of cultural norms and structure, meaning, oh, this is my superior that's saying this, so I agree.
Well, no, Yamamoto would be the superior.
Oh, well then, sorry. I thought the admiral called. That wasn't the case?
Right, the admiral in command of that specific fleet.
Right.
Yamamoto is in charge of the entire Japanese Imperial Navy.
Man, I'm already confused about huge facts about World War II that shouldn't be happening, but I'm glad my confusion can lead to more exposition for the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's weird. I'm glad he did not wipe out absolutely everything.
Having the war go to 1947 would have been disastrous.
Yeah.
Although, in retrospect, it might not have, because then we would have had the entire United States military going after the Japanese main islands,
Mm-hmm.
all of our allies.
Right.
So it
Yeah,
might
it would
not
have
have taken
unfolded
additional
differently.
2 years. But also, on the other hand, the horrificness of war would have probably wiped out the Japanese home islands.
Do you think, I think about how it ended in our timeline where
Mm-hmm.
we dropped 2 nuclear bombs on their homeland? I wonder if that would have happened on another island. You know what I mean? Like, if the fight was extended and we were doing the island hopping and we had the technology, would we have hit another target maybe instead of dropping it on Japan itself?
I don't know.
Let's explore the
Hypothetically,
possibilities together.
if all of the allies were fighting against just the Japanese, they might have not used the nuclear bombs at all. Because at that point, they would have had millions and millions of men. It would have been
Yeah, I know
horrific,
Yeah, it would have been
but
horrific for both sides for sure.
it would have been more horrific for the Japanese.
Oh yeah.
That also means that China would have been there as well. And they had already been victimized by the Japanese for well over a decade by that point, if not longer.
Oh yeah. The heat definitely would have been turned up.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. The bombs were ready. And
Mm-hmm.
then there would have been less loss of life after they were dropped.
And I know that they were very much dependent on external, like, resources from other places, oil, rubber, steel even. So maybe they just would have realized, hey, we're out of stuff. We can't fight.
Yeah, they could have also been just cut off.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
Everybody taking a defensive measure and just cutting off that entire region from all supplies until everybody in there
Yeah.
starved.
Yeah, that doesn't sound appealing.
It's horrific no matter what happened.
Yeah, we are talking about war after all.
Yes.
I get it.
All right. So let's get into the ships that were lost or damaged. 21 American ships were damaged or lost in this attack. And all of them but 3 were repaired and returned to service. So the battleships. The Arizona was hit by 4 armor-piercing bombs. It sank. It was a total loss and not salvaged. 1,177 were killed.
Golly.
And of course, there's now a memorial over her.
Mm-hmm.
She capsized and was a total loss. She was salvaged. And she sank en route to scrapping May 1947. 429 were killed.
Ugh.
The West Virginia was hit by 2 bombs and 7 torpedoes. She sank to the bottom, but was returned to service July of 1944. 106 lost their lives. The USS California was hit by 2 bombs, 2 torpedoes. She also sank and was returned to service January 1944. 104 lost their lives. The USS Nevada was hit by 6 bombs, 1 torpedo, and she was beached and returned to service October of 1942. 60 lost their lives. The USS Pennsylvania was in dry dock with the Cassin and Downs. It was hit by one bomb and debris from the USS Cassin. And she remained in service. She lost 9. The USS Tennessee was hit by 2 bombs and returned to service February of 1942. 5 men lost their lives. The USS Maryland was hit by 2 bombs and returned to service February of 1942. 4 were killed on her. The USS Utah, which was a ex-battleship and was actually a target/AA training ship, was hit by 2 torpedoes, capsized. She was a total loss, and they did not salvage her at all. 64 lost their lives, and she was also turned into a memorial. Let's move on to the cruisers. The USS Helena was hit by a torpedo. She returned to service January 1942. 20 lost their lives on her. The USS Raleigh, hit by a torpedo and returned to service February of 1942. The USS Honolulu only received light damage because she only had a near miss, and she stayed in service.
Wow.
The USS Cassin, as stated before, she was in dry dock, was hit by a bomb, burned, and then reconstructed and returned to service in February of 1944. The USS Downs, also in the dry dock, caught fire when the Cassin was hit. She burned, was rebuilt, and returned to service in November of 1943. The USS Helm, who was underway to West Loch, was damaged by 2 near-miss bombs. She continued on her patrol, then dry docked on January 15th of 1942, and then got back underway January 20th of 1942. The USS Shaw was hit by 3 bombs and returned to service in June of 1942. The auxiliary ships, the USS Oglala, which was a mine layer, was damaged by a torpedo that hit the Helena. She capsized and was returned to service as an engine repair ship on February of 1944. The USS Vastal, which was a repair ship, was hit by 2 bombs. She also got hit by blast and fire from the Arizona. They beached her and was returned to service by August of 1942. The USS Curtis, which was a seaplane tender, was hit by 1 bomb. 1 Japanese aircraft crashed into her, and she was returned to service in January of 1942. She had 19 die on aboard her. The USS Sotoyomo was a harbor tug and was damaged by explosions and fires from the USS Shaw. She sank and was returned to service on August 1942. The YFD-2, which was the floating yard dock, was damaged by bombs, sunk, and returned to service January 25th, 1942, and they put the Shaw into her to fix her.
Okay. Just amazed listening to the massive quantity of loss of life, but then also the response like, hey, the ship we're going to fix, this, or we're going to try to scrap, or just the decisions that had to be made after the fact. I mean, there's no time to grieve necessarily. We're at war. We need to get on with things, and then later. And that's all of this time frame is really tough, but just highlighting how difficult that decision is.
So after the search for survivors, Captain Homer N. Wallen was ordered to leave a formal salvage operation. So around Pearl Harbor, divers from the Navy and the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, and also civilian contractors, began work on the ships that could be refloated. They patched holes, cleared debris, and pumped water out of ships. Within 6 months, 5 battleships and 2 cruisers were patched or refloated so they could be sent to shipyards in Pearl and on the mainland for extensive repair. This continued for a whole year. 20,000 man-hours underwater were needed for this.
Wow.
The Nevada was actually very, very difficult to raise and repair. They lost 2 guys during this operation. when they were inside the ship and inhaled poisonous gases.
Ay.
Let's see. So let's get into some news coverage. You want to know how fast news traveled, right?
Oh my gosh, I'm sure it was. This is television's just coming on the scene at this point, right? I mean, it's mostly radio, but oh no, not quite yet.
Yeah. It was going to be radio when most people are going to be hearing it.
Mm-hmm.
So the initial announcement of the attack on Pearl Harbor was made by the White House press secretary, Stephen Early, at 2:22 p.m. Eastern Time, which is 8:52 a.m. Hawaiian Time. Quote, "The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor from the air and all naval and military activities on the island of Oahu, principal American base in the Hawaiian Islands." The initial reports of the attack moved on news wires at about 3 minutes later of the initial announcement. The first radio coverage was on the CBS radio network scheduled news program, World News Today, at 14:30 Eastern Time. John Charles Daly read the initial report. Then switched to London, where Robert Trout ad-libbed on the possible London reaction. The first report on NBC cut into a radio drama of the Inspector General at 14:33. This only lasted 21 seconds, because at this time, only brief interruptions were allowed of scheduled commercial programming.
Yeah, that's how times have changed.
Oh, yeah. Now, they did cover the attacks on television, but again, commercial television had just started 6 months before this.
Right.
So only a couple thousand people had TVs.
Exactly.
Most of them were actually in New York City. There was also just a handful of TV stations, and they were all in New York, Chicago, LA, and Philadelphia.
That makes sense.
Of course, also television programming was not aired 24/7.
Oh.
They actually only aired programs sporadically.
Well, with the new technology, you're not going to have enough to drive a full day of programming, or even part of a day. So
yeah. There was actually only one TV station at that time that was regularly airing during the day in the country, and that was the New York WNBT. They were playing the comedy movie Millionaire Playboy.
One of my favorites.
And,
no, just this movie.
Yeah. And they actually did interrupt that broadcast to,
get the word out.
To tell the 500 people with TVs in New York, hey, guys, guess what just happened?
Well, they're not listening to the radio. They got to find out somehow.
Yeah. The only other station known to cover the attacks was WCBW, which was also out of New York, and they did a special report broadcast that evening. Unfortunately, there are, of course, no copies of these broadcasts in existence anymore.
Right. I know the nation was on edge just because of what was happening in Europe, and I think there was some talk about the imperial ambitions of Japan in circles in America. It wasn't like the most common thing talked about, but I'm just trying to imagine the surprise of the nation as a whole.
Yeah. So, how about the Japanese coverage?
Oh, I do.
So, at around 7 a.m. Japanese Standard Time, there was an announcement that Japan had entered into a situation of war with the U.S. and Britain in the Western Pacific. The first news of the attack happened at 11:30 a.m. There was no further elaboration or explanation, and the attacks were already finished by the time everybody there heard about it.
Yeah,
the attack was eventually covered in the Japanese press, but of course, the press in wartime Japan was heavily censored. One Japanese newspaper, the Asahi Shimbun, report on the attack the day it occurred And from that point forward, their editorials began to back governmental decisions, regardless of what those decisions were.
Yeah, I'm glad there's a record of their take, but when you're just become an arm of propaganda,
Mm-hmm.
how can you really tell what is happening?
Yeah. That newspaper also reported the declaration of war on the U.S., framing it as an imperial order, which most Japanese people did take it that way. In contrast, the New York Times focused on, quote, the danger to democracy and to the nation brought on by the attack.
I'm sure we have, oh, you know what would be great? So I don't know if I guess I do know some of the age range of our listeners, but there are these things called microfiche machines, and you can see them in movies of the past where people would look up news articles and it was the coolest. And you would turn dials and goes woo, 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 and you'd go to a miniaturized version of some newspaper article. And I would love to right now look up the headlines of the New York Times from that day. I would be curious what the threat to democracy was then. That seems like a very tangible and real threat to democracy being attacked by the Empire of Japan.
All you got to do is go to the New York Times website now.
Oh, there's no tactile. How enjoyable is that? You got to go and look for the right thing of microfiche and put it in the machine and sorry. Anyway, people, there are experiences you miss with advances in technology. Although that is a good idea too. Later, I'll pull up the website and just go, huh?
You can just
I mean, yes, I could provide my own soundtrack.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for helping me.
Yeah.
Live my dream.
All right. So let's get into the aftermath.
Okay.
While you go, woo, 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 woo.
Woo, 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 woo. There are people out there pointing at their podcast device or computer going, yes, yes. I recall those days. Back when television was new. Proceed. Aftermath. Let's hit it.
All right. So the day after the attack, that is when FDR delivered the famous Day of Infamy speech to the joint session of Congress, calling for a formal declaration of war on the Empire of Japan. And of course, Congress didn't even take too much time, less than an hour, to say, yes, we're on board. Yes, we have to do it. On December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S., even though the pact that the Germany, Italian, and Japanese had did not really.
Right.
So, thinking about this, what do you think the state of World War II on the European side would look like if the U.S. did not go over there and just concentrated solely on Japan?
Because we were still, like with the Lend-Lease Act and other supportive initiatives for England, we were still involved loosely.
Right, but if we're only fighting Japan, that's going to stop because we need that material now.
That's true. But I mean, that was happening. So how did it unfold anyway? We were fighting in the Pacific theater and the European theater. So all the resources we have were split amongst those two. If you would have consolidated that to one,
the majority of everything went over to the European theater.
Right.
Because that is where FDR and Churchill were like, we have to go Germany.
Right.
Thing.
That was the policy, the direction.
Which is why only a portion of the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps were fighting in the Pacific. And it wasn't until the European theater started winding down is when Army units started coming over.
Yeah, that would have been They were probably looking for an excuse to declare war anyway. Germany, in particular, wanted license to be able to destroy United States material because it was the lifeline for the British.
I think it would
So-
have looked a lot different.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That would have been... I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
If they would not have declared war, what would America have done?
But by this time, Hitler's brain was almost halfway rotted away by his syphilis anyways.
Well,
That's the rumor.
we are an information podcast, but an entertainment podcast.
After Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S., Congress turned around and said, you know what?
All right.
Bet.
Quote unquote. That's exactly what they said.
The UK had, of course, already been in this war for quite a while.
Hmm.
But Churchill promised to declare war within the hour of a Japanese attack on the U.S. And when he learned about it, he promptly determined that there was no need to either wait for further consulting with the U.S. government and immediately summoned the Japanese ambassador. So the UK actually declared war on Japan 9 hours before the U.S. did.
That's a good friend right there.
Mhm.
That's just like, hey, we got you.
Yeah. The attack was a huge shock initially for all of the Allies in the Pacific theater.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it was because of further losses compounding. Because the Japanese also attacked the Philippines. 3 days after the attack, the battleship Prince of Wales and the battleship Repulse were sunk off the coast of Malaya, causing Churchill to say, quote, "In all the war, I have never received a more direct shock. As I turned and twisted in the bed, and full horror of the news sank in upon me. There was no British or American capital ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific except the American survivors of Pearl Harbor, who were hastening back to California. Over this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we everywhere were weak and naked." Another thing that happened because of this attack was that Pearl Harbor was used in American propaganda a whole lot.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But is it, I don't know. At some point, it's just like, hey, remember this? Remember this happened, right? This thing happened. So what are we going to do about it? So I get that it is propaganda and they're trying to advance recruitment or support for the war. But it's also good to have a reminder of things that occurred.
Well, it's not the first time Americans have done something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Remember the Alamo?
I do remember the Alamo, but I've been told.
Well, that was the propaganda, was remember the
Yeah.
Alamo. And then more modern,
And,
September 11th.
and remember the Maine.
9/11.
That's true.
We will never forget.
Never forget.
Another consequence of the attack on Pearl was that the Japanese American residents and civilians were relocated to internment camps. Well,
Yeah.
They were called internment camps, but they were concentration camps.
Well, I guess.
Without cyanide.
Well, concentration means we're just going to concentrate people in an area of a type, like the Japanese Americans, for example, in this case.
Yeah.
And they are interned
Yeah.
I can see both.
Within hours of the attack, hundreds of Japanese American leaders were rounded up and taken to high security camps such as Sand Island at the mouth of Honolulu Harbor and Kealua military camp on the island of Hawaii, or the Big Island.
Okay.
Eventually, more than 110,000 Japanese Americans, pretty much every single one that lived on the West Coast, were forced into concentration camps.
It wasn't until, I think, the 80s or 90s that they apologized for that.
Yeah, it took way longer than it should have to apologize for it.
I think whenever a nation goes into war generally, but especially when its entry is due to a shocking attack like this, or 9/11, for example, there will be reactions and overreactions.
Yeah.
You have to do something, is the impetus. And so this was something. It's like, hey, we should do this because of that. Yeah, you're right. And I think
Victimizing
that's
people based on their race or their religion is never cool.
it is hard to do the actual work of sussing out people's loyalties. Like, hey, are you communicating with Imperial Japan and passing along secrets? If so, we would like to have a word with you. Instead, I'm going to use a, what is the word I'm looking for? Thinking free activity of, oh, they have connection to Japan, round them up. So,
Yes, take their property, round them up, put them in this camp, don't feed them very well, keep 110 of them, 110,000 of them in this one little area, throw up barbed wire and guys with guns.
and not only that, but a lot of them on the West Coast were farmers or ranchers, or they had things going on in life that they had to maintain. And if they're not there to do that, those things go away. And so even when they're released, they may not have the home that they had previously.
Oh, they
Due
didn't.
to,
They were seized.
right.
All their property was seized.
Well, I've heard some stories like there were some local farmers that were eyeing a Japanese man's farm, and then he was taken away, and they're like, okay, when it goes up for auction, we're ready to pounce. But one of his neighbors just maintained the farm, kept paying on it, and so when the guy returned, everything was. I love hearing stories like that. I think
Oh,
that was the
absolutely.
rule, though.
It
That
was
was,
definitely not the rule.
yeah, that was the exception.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, oh, I know this guy. He's a good neighbor. I'm going to be a good neighbor.
All right. So in Hawaii, there were 150,000 plus Japanese Americans. The Japanese Americans consisted over a third of the population.
Whoa.
Still does. The diversity over on the Hawaiian Islands is heartwarming and awesome, and I loved it. But they only rounded up and interned between 12 and 1,800 of them.
Okay.
So, bonus points to Hawaii, I guess.
I wonder if there were just suspicions ahead of time. Like, hey, you know what? These guys, even within the community, it's like they don't seem as big on the U.S. as we are. Especially when your area is attacked directly like that and so many people die. That's a big shock. And you will suss out who is corroborating with the perpetrators.
Possibly. Hawaii is a much smaller community,
Yeah.
so people know people more than they would, say, in California.
Yeah, I believe that.
All right, let's get to the international consequences. The Canadian province of British Columbia, they border the Pacific Ocean, and they had a large population of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Canadian descendants. The pre-war tensions did not help after the attack. The Canadian government reacted on February 24th, 1942, and they passed the War Measures Act, allowing the forced removal of any and all Canadians of Japanese descent from British Columbia, and prohibited them from returning to the province.
So they just pushed them east or expelled them completely?
Well, 12,000 were interned in camps, 2,000 were sent to road camps, and 2,000 were forced to work in the prairies on sugar beet farms.
Ooh.
So the medals that were awarded: 15 Medals of Honor, 51 Navy Crosses, 53 Silver Stars, 4 Navy Marine Corps medals, 1 Distinguished Flying Cross, 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 1 Distinguished Service Medal, and 3 Bronze Stars. Later, a special military award, the Pearl Harbor Commemorative Medal, was authorized for all veterans of the attack.
Those are some serious awards.
Yes.
Distinguished Flying Cross. Wow. I guess I just, in my mind, I think that, oh, we didn't have time to get to the planes and get into action, but no, we talked about that last time.
Mm-hmm.
There were some that scrambled as quickly as they could.
It wasn't very many, but yeah, there were a few.
Yeah.
Let's talk quickly about the Nihao incident. The Japanese planners had determined that they would have to have a way to rescue flyers who lost their aircraft. The island of Nihao, only 30 minutes from air from Pearl Harbor, was designated as the rescue point. During the second wave, a Zero flown by Petty Officer Shigenori Nishikachi of the Hiru was damaged in the attack on Wheeler, so he flew to the rescue point. It was further damaged when he crash-landed it. The petty officer was helped from the wreckage by one of the native Hawaiians who, aware of the tensions between the U.S. and Japan, took the pilot's pistol, maps, codes, and other documents. Now, the Hawaiians didn't have any telephones or radios and were completely unaware of the attack on Pearl. So the pilot enlisted the support of 3 Japanese-American residents in an attempt to recover the documents. And during the struggle, the pilot was killed and a Hawaiian was wounded. One of the 3 collaborators committed suicide, and his wife and the 3rd collaborator was sent to prison. The Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara summed up the results by saying, quote, "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war." The attack did accomplish its intended objective, but it turned out to be largely unnecessary, which Yamamoto didn't know. The U.S. Navy had decided as far back as 1935 to abandon charging across the Pacific towards the Philippines in response to an outbreak of war.
Really?
The U.S. instead adopted Plan Dog in 1940, which emphasized keeping the IJN out of the Eastern Pacific and away from the shipping lanes to Australia, while the U.S. concentrated on defeating Nazi Germany. Of course, the aircraft carriers were untouched, so the Pacific Fleet did not lose their offensive capabilities.
Thank goodness.
Also, this attack meant that the Navy was left with no choice but to rely on carriers and submarines, which gave them the advantage of learning how to use both effectively.
Just an interesting consequence of what happened.
Yeah. After the battleships repaired and returned to service, their low speed and high fuel consumption limited their effectiveness, and they were used mainly in shore bombardment roles. A major flaw by the Japanese strategic thinkers was that the ultimate Pacific battle would be fought by battleships.
Right, that was their main targets.
Yeah. So that means that the Japanese Navy hoarded their battleships for the decisive battle, which never happened.
Right. It's always easier to see the folly of a decision decades after the fact and with professional historians digging into all the facts at hand.
Yeah. Also, the Japanese confidence in their ability to win a quick victory meant that they neglected all the services in Pearl Harbor. They were all these targets were omitted from their list, but they proved to be much more important than any battleship to the American war effort in the Pacific. The survivals of all these services allowed Pearl Harbor to maintain logistical support of the Navy. Allowed them to do things like the Doolittle Raid, the Battles of the Coral Sea, and Midway. The American submarines immobilized the Imperial Japanese Navy's heavy ships and brought Japan's economy to a virtual standstill by sinking Japanese commercial shipping.
Whoa.
And oil was almost completely stopped. So that is going to be that for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Any final thoughts?
I'll keep it brief.
Oh, you don't want to.
Well, I just think about, we talk a lot about war because we talk a lot about the Navy, and the Navy is involved in war, and that's important. They'd have to do this. I know they felt like, hey, we need to strike now and completely debilitate the Americans because otherwise they're just going to come after us. But really, like you said, America didn't want to get involved. Maybe once Japan got big enough and intimidating enough and was enough of a threat, they would have. But honestly, if they would have not done that, and we were pulled into war with Europe anyway, which I think we were going that way anyway, they could have built their strength up in the East. And then by the time we return haggard and spent from fighting a war in Europe, we wouldn't have wanted to mess with them. You know what I mean? But then if they decide to attack, they should have gone all the way, and they didn't. It's easy for me to be an armchair quarterback decades after the fact. But I guess any decision to go to war should really be taken from all angles and as seriously as possible, because it cripples the nation, like the economy and the lives spent.
Depends
Even
on the
the-
economy.
You think?
Boosted the American economy. It brought us out of the Great Depression.
In a way, yeah, that happened. But there was still rationing that had to occur. Like, the economy was still severely impacted. You hear stories of women not being able to wear pantyhose because nylon was rationed. And so there were certain basic materials. It's like, we can only have so much bread or sugar, or even basic household goods were limited.
Supply
And
was rationed, yes. But the economy,
Yes.
everybody was working.
That, yes, I know that shouldn't be the reason you go to war, though. It's like, hey, we're in a massive depression. I know what'll fix this. Let's launch a war.
Unfortunately, that's been a reason to go to war for a lot of people.
I agree. Perhaps sound fiscal policy would be a good war preventative. Anyway, yes, I'm always a little depressed after hearing about all the deaths.
As you should be.
All hands on the Arizona going down.
Not
And,
all hands, but the majority of them. But that was by far the biggest loss of life during that attack was on board the Arizona.
Right. And I know there's an inclination. It's like, what could we have done differently to prevent this? And like we had brought up in previous episodes, the planes were seen on the radar, and they're like, those are bombers coming in from California. And so there's all these little things that if somebody would have changed how they responded, maybe it wouldn't have been as bad. But then
No, it wouldn't.
maybe it would have been
Plus,
worse.
with all the intelligence they were getting about it as well. That everything,
Mm.
people drop balls.
Right.
It would have gone
And so,
completely different had everybody paid attention, listened to everybody else, and was like, oh, this is going to happen. We need to be on alert instead of playing volleyball half naked on the beach.
you always got to throw in a Top Gun reference. No, but I think, I guess my takeaway then is, as an individual learning a lesson from history, I should listen. I should do the right thing regardless of how difficult that is. And I should pay attention. Like, there's stuff happening, and the best you can do is be prepared for, and then making connections with people. Like, I think about what you were talking about, the Hawaiians that were rounded up by their fellow Hawaiians. You know, they were a community. They kind of knew. I'm making some assumptions in this statement. I do understand that. They were able to suss out, oh, we don't need to intern 150,000 Japanese Americans or Japanese Hawaiians. These guys are suspect, though, so let's focus on that. Do the right thing, work hard, pay attention, listen, build community. I think those are all good lessons. And maybe we won't have war. Oh, and sound fiscal policy, of course.
All right. So we are going to honor one of our fallen angels. With the help of HeroCards.us, we're going to honor Corporal Christopher D. Daniel Greer. His hometown was Ashland City, Tennessee. He served with the U.S. Marine Corps, 4th Combat Engineer Battalion. His date of sacrifice was August 8th, 2010, killed in action in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. He was 25. Christopher D. Daniel Greer had been a full-time firefighter in Ashland City, Tennessee. He joined the Marines to serve his family, friends, and country. Greer was assigned to Company D, 4th Combat Engineering Battalion, 4th Marine Division, Marine Forces Reserve out of Knoxville, Tennessee. On his first deployment after joining the Marines in April of 2006, he was promoted to corporal. He served with the Explosive Ordnance Disposal, EOD team, clearing improvised explosive devices to make buildings, roads, and paths safe for fellow soldiers and the Afghan people. As he did in his civilian life, Corporal Greer risked his life for others on a daily basis in what CBS News reporter Terry McCarthy referred to as, quote, the most dangerous job in Afghanistan. Greer was killed in the line of duty on August 2010. Fellow engineer from Company D, Corporal Benjamin L. Ledbetter, commented, quote, being a firefighter in the civilian world, Corporal Greer to us was already a hero. So Corporal Christopher D. Daniel Greer, we thank you. All right, XO, take us out.
All right, Captain. Thank you so much for what we have to say. Trust me, I know people that would like to do anything else but that. So we appreciate you being here. If you like what we talk about and enjoy our company, share it with a friend. You can rate and review us on various platforms. That helps us get the word out about what we're talking about. If you have a recommendation of, hey, I served on this ship and we saw this thing and would really love to talk about it, you can reach out to us. A couple ways to do that. One, you can email us, NavyHistoryPodcast@gmail.com. You can also catch us on X.com, formerly Twitter.com, and the handle is NHistoryPod with an @ in the front. We also have a Discord server, so if you want to see the picture I posted about the different camouflage that they put on ships to make it look all weird for submarines, join the Discord server and see that picture. It's there.
No,
One
I
of
think
us
you
did
did
it.
that.
I feel better about myself. Anyway, yeah. Thank you again. We couldn't do this without... if we did this without you, it would just be two weirdos talking about history, which is fine, but it makes a lot more sense when we like, hey, people are actually listening to us, and so my wife can go, okay, not weird. Thank you.
Weird in other ways.
Well, yes, just enough weird. Like the right, acceptable, like eccentric maybe, but not like, oh, gotta watch out for that guy.
We still do.
Well, maybe I should just quit while I'm ahead.
We're going to all wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Bye.
Bye-bye.